Hello everyone, this is part 13 of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto felt exactly as out of place as he had assumed he would, shrinking back into a wall and hoping nobody noticed him as he watched the dozen or so people mingle and chat. Ino appeared to have commandeered her own house for the night, as her parents were nowhere in sight. It was just the handful of teens. Neji was here, of course, sitting on the other side of the room and generally being pampered by his female teammate. His only consolation was that the stuck-up Hyuga seemed just as uncomfortable with all of this as he was. Lee was bouncing from place to place. He had only been on a handful of missions with the bowl-haired taijutsu user, and found every single experience exhausting. He was another one to avoid, although he seemed far too invested challenging everyone in sight to various challenges he seemed to make up on the spot, often going through with them alone when people politely, or in some cases not so politely, refused. As if a mirror to his enthusiasm, Shikamaru was doing his best to suck all of the energy from a 3-foot radius around his person, only counted by Chuji sitting next to him, happily gorging his way through the snacks Ino had provided. The last of the Ino Shika Cho was reveling in the atmosphere. She flitted from person to person, stirring up conversation and soaking it in like the helpless gossip monger she was. The only one apparently immune to her charms was Shino, who had arrived, given his congratulations to Neji for making it back to the village, then left as soon as he could, citing other things to do. Naruto cursed him for that. Now he couldn't make the same excuse and leave like he so desperately wanted to. Then again, Kiba was more than boisterous enough to make up for Shino's absence, essentially being as loud as two people. There was also Akamaru, who was beginning to grow into the fearsome size most Inuzuka nin dogs were known for. He was lavishing under Sasuke's hand, whining occasionally as the Uchiha scratched him behind the ears. The dark-haired teen had lightened up a great deal since the academy, especially after his promotion to Chunin, but he was still naturally inclined to be antisocial and seemed to use the enormous canine as a shield against being pulled into conversation. Which left, naturally. "You're doing an impressive job of hiding back here," Hinata said as she slipped over, having just escaped a slightly too in-depth session with Ino. "I picked it out the moment I walked in," he admitted, taking a quick sip from his cup, tea, that he had been nursing without commitment the entire time he had been here. "Just the right amount of shadow so that I'm not invisible and people wonder where I am, but not so open that when they spot me it's obvious." She laughed at that, even though it hadn't meant to be a joke. "It's not a mission, Naruto-kun." She glanced around the room. "You should talk to someone." "I'm talking to you, aren't I?" He drawled absently, noticing how she glanced away to hide her slight blush. "I think Shikamaru has had his eye on getting you into a shogi match," she muttered, pulling herself together much faster than she used to. "I'm counting on the fact that he won't think the effort to come over and ask worth it," he returned, this time wearing a small smile himself. He was actually a little glad Hinata had come over. This was a lot less awkward. Of all the people here, she was certainly the most tolerable, and others would be less likely to bother him. "Are you really scared to talk to people that much?" she asked, almost making it sound like a challenge. He wasn't going to let himself get baited so easily, but still, the brazenness of the question surprised him. "It's not fear, it's pragmatism. I have nothing to say." There was that impish smile again. When exactly had she added that look to her repertoire? That sounds like an excuse. He matched her grin for grin, assuming that she would wilt first. "Because it is." Again, she surprised him when she held his gaze unflinchingly. When had they gotten so close? Her scent filled his nose for a moment. Cyanide. No. Benzaldehyde, almonds. He was around poisons way too much. She hadn't moved back, they were still very close. Was she leaning in? He was saved from answering that question when Ino called out to the room. "All right, you miserable lot, that's enough lingering at the edges of the room." She grinned mischievously and Naruto quashed a small sigh of relief at the excuse to turn away from Hinata and look. "My dad's been telling me all sorts of stories about the drinking games they used to play back in his day, and she produced a large and expensive-looking bottle of sake from thin air, plan on trying 'em all tonight." Naruto glanced around the room and gauged the reaction, most of them enthusiastic. Despite the fact that most of them were in positions to buy alcohol themselves, only the 3 Junin in the room could legally get a hold of the hard stuff before they were 18. Naruto didn't, Hinata wouldn't, and Shikamaru didn't care enough to. The rest felt that giddy sense of rule breaking that was supposed to be part and parcel with being a normal teenager. Naruto thought they were a little beyond that, with most ninja using alcohol to alleviate the trauma of their profession, but nevertheless found himself being drawn towards the center of the room alongside everyone else, towards the circle of chairs Ino had set up. He quickly snagged the one between Sasuke and Tenten, needing a little space from Hinata for the moment. It was also coincidentally away from Shikamaru, who had indeed been giving him calculating looks all night. Everything moved somewhat predictably from there. Those that were inclined to, drank copiously, reveling in it. Kiba especially, although Chuji, and surprisingly enough Sasuke, got their fill. Tenten also partook, her cheeks steadily getting rosier through the night, although not so much that she couldn't keep an eye on Lee. Apparently, the Chakra Challenge teen was completely banned from any form of alcohol, although she refused to elaborate why. Everyone took it as a joke until Neji confirmed it with a grave expression. Shikamaru seemed to drink plenty of his own, and it looked practiced, but he never seemed to lose his edge. If he was pretending to drink, Naruto couldn't work out how. He certainly wasn't doing it the same way Naruto was, by inscribing a small storage seal on his palm and siphoning away all but a few sips of his drink. It was a waste of good alcohol, and Ino really had sprung for some good stuff, but this was a company he didn't want to lose his inhibitions around. Hinata was possibly the biggest surprise, taking to the games with gusto as her remaining shyness quickly bled away. She seemed determined to match Ino drink for drink, drawing the two girls into a bit of a spiral in that regard until the pretense of the games themselves was dropped altogether and the entire circle descended into friendly banter. "So Ino, how's torture and interrogation going?" Shikamaru asked, slipping the question in with a surgeon's precision after one of Kiba's boasts about his last mission. It would have been the stuff of legends, were any of it not completely bloated out of all semblance of truth by the Inuzuka's ego. "Oh, you know, Daddy's got me doing busy work to make me feel like I'm doing something important, but I'm learning a lot from what I do get to see." Her lips twisted slightly. "Although I could do without that Anko woman doing her best to twist me into some kind of demented copy of her." "I dunno," Kiba grinned, nudging Chuji boisterously. The large teen just seemed annoyed that he nearly spilled some of his drink. "I think the village could do with a few more like Anko. Man, I look forward to the missions I get to go on with her." "I didn't know infiltration experts were asked to go on dog-walking jobs," Sasuke cut in with a smirk, earning a few chuckles from the circle as Kiba blustered for a comeback. He was beaten to the punch when Shikamaru cut in again. "I haven't had the pleasure of working with her myself." Half the people in the room winced, Naruto included. "You aren't missing much," Chuji muttered, hiding the rest of his response behind a drink and a blush. "She's loud, both in personality, attire, and volume," Tenten added, looking down at herself self-consciously. "You don't need to sugarcoat it," Ino groused. She didn't seem to enjoy having the conversational limelight off her for very long. "She's a nightmare. Once she's latched onto you, it takes divine intervention to get her off. I don't understand why Daddy trusts her with so much. Or the Hokage for that matter." Shikamaru's eyebrow quirked. "What do you mean?" Ino rolled her eyes. "Oh, you get the idea that it's all hush-hush, but she can't help but drop all these stupid little hints that she's being sent on these classified missions into Kiri." "So," Sasuke said. He seemed nonchalant, but it was obvious he was just as interested as Shikamaru. Naruto would be lying if he said he wasn't a little intrigued himself. He hadn't heard anything down his personal grapevine about this. Most missions to Kiri are classified these days. It's war. Yeah, but the way she goes on you'd think she was being sent to assassinate the Mizukage, or coordinate with the rebels or something." "Rebels?" Chuji asked, brow furrowing. Hinata interrupted, apparently having to fight through the haze of alcohol for lucidity. "That's supposed to be classified to non-Junin. Even you're not supposed to know Ino." The blonde simply smiled conspiratorially. "Let's just say there's a lot that I know that I shouldn't." Chuji nearly snorted into his drink, apparently only refraining so he wouldn't spill any. "You mean, things you eavesdrop on your dad to know?" That earned him a piece of food thrown at his head. "Don't ruin my mystique, Chuji." The large boy, again, seemed more annoyed by the waste of food than the fact it was aimed at him. Like what? Sasuke cut in, now leaning forward. Naruto had to quell a sigh. His old teammate was a little predictable at times. Perhaps if we're not supposed to know, we shouldn't ask, Neji said, the first full sentence Naruto had heard him speak all night aside from monosyllables and half-hearted dismissals. Oh, come off it, Neji, Tenten countered. As if you're not dying to know yourself. Hell, a year away from the village. You should be clamoring for information. Indeed, my youthful companion, Lee Waden, apparently having been content to sit back and enjoy the festive energy of the gathering until now. Would we all not benefit from being more informed? As Guy Sensei says, knowing is half the battle. The other half being fists. Or, perhaps, some things are made secret for a reason, Shikamaru muttered, clearly not willing to put in the energy to argue the point. Why don't we ask Naruto then? Kiba asked, earning an irritated look from the blonde in question. He had been perfectly happy letting this run its course. He's the king of secrets, right? Kiba-kun, Hinata admonished. Weirdo in the academy, then he shoots through the ranks while barely acknowledging the rest of us, the Inuzuka continued, ignoring her, if he even heard. You'd prefer weekly updates. Naruto shot back blandly, biting back some of the more colorful responses his mind came up with. Apparently, he hadn't been doing quite as good a job of not drinking as he had thought. I'd prefer you not pretend like you're so much better than us, acting all mysterious and aloof just because you got to Junin first. And what does that say about you, Mutt? Sasuke drawled, taking a long sip of his drink and giving the tiniest hint of a nod to his old teammate. Huh. Naruto had thought that connection tenuous at best. He hadn't considered there was a resource there he could. No, bad thoughts. That's the alcohol, don't regress into that person. He instead gave a thankful nod in return, small enough that Sasuke only saw because he was looking for it. What's that supposed to mean, pink eye? If you hadn't noticed, we're the same rank. For now, Sasuke replied, smirking that infuriating smirk. Students of Kakashi together. Troublesome, Shikamaru sighed. He's just baiting you, Kiba. The wild-haired boy huffed irritably. As if he knows any more about this war than they rest of us. Man, us Chunin are kept completely in the dark. He turned, mood swinging like a pendulum as he glanced at Hinata imploringly. Come of Hinata-chan, they must have told you guys something interesting. Junin get all the juicy info. Sorry Kiba, Hinata shrugged, the brief argument apparently sobering her a bit. Come on, the teen whined. No secret invasion plans, big tactical overviews, hidden manipulators behind it all. If Hinata-sama knew, then she wouldn't be allowed to tell you, Inuzuka, so perhaps you should quieten down, Neji cut in with the dry condescension famous to his clan. Hinata-sama. That was a bit of a turnaround. Naruto wondered if it was a response to his kidnapping, or this was something that had been brewing before. Then his mind wound back to Kiba's plea and he paused, the words doing loops around his head. Hidden manipulator. It couldn't be. He had been looking at the events surrounding the Suna development as a natural evolution of the war he started. But if he accounted for a hidden hand guiding events, it was the first time he realized there was somebody standing on the other side of the board, and it made a lot of things click into place. The sudden diversion from Kiri's introspective war to their aggression. Suna's continued turnaround. Their unlikely alliance. That, of course, left the question of just who it was. He wasn't going to work that out here, but now he was set on the path he had a lot of avenues to explore. He'd have to shift his planning board around a bit, but already he could feel previously unmoving cogs begin to mesh into place in his head. Then he realized he had been staring at the floor for a good 2 minutes without even pretending to follow the conversation along. You alright, Naruto? Shikamaru asked, something calculating glinting in his eye. The blonde blinked, then smiled sheepishly, easily slipping the mask back on. Must be the drink. It's hitting a bit harder than I thought. He could tell the crafty Nara didn't buy it at all. Apparently, he wasn't the only one who noticed the other was only going through the motions. On that note, he stood, feigning more drowsiness than his racing mind felt. I should probably head off. What? Ino called, rosy-cheeked and pouting like a pro. You can't leave yet. The night's still young. He grinned back, hiding the annoyance that grew with every second he was kept from unraveling this new mystery. We're shinobi, this is practically morning for us. Still, he could tell the girl was more annoyed he seemed to be immune to her adorable pout than for the fact he was leaving. They really were a weird bunch. He turned and walked out, waving a quick goodbye to everyone else as he left. He was just leaving the front door when he felt a hand grasp his own. He wasn't quite sure who looked more surprised when he turned, him or Hinata. "Why you didn't say goodbye properly," she muttered, covering for her own apparent rashness a little hurriedly. "What's a proper good?" He never got the chance to finish as, her confidence fading quick, Hinata darted forward and pressed a light, chaste kiss to his cheek. Any response she could have had to that was rendered moot as she turned a violent red, squeaked something out, and retreated back into the house in a flash of purple hair. Suddenly, all thoughts of invisible manipulators and metaphorical shogi games were swept from his mind as surely as sand in a breeze. He stood there, blinking for a moment, before recovering his faculties. It wasn't like he hadn't noticed Hinata's obvious attraction to him, he just never thought she would ever have the courage to do anything about it. Apparently, his influence on her ran deeper than he thought. Well, that was a whole different barrel of problems, wasn't it? Mizu no Kuni was an appallingly dreary country. Perhaps Naruto was being unfair, he had only seen small swathes of the island nation. But, as he slipped on another slick branch, dripping with condensation, he didn't particularly care. Konoha trees were stout and tall, with thick branches suited to a ninja's foot. Kiri's trees were thin, sun-starved, brittle things that were either so drenched in water that even using chakra to find purchase was difficult, or the branches would snap under even a nimble shinobi's foot. No wonder Kiri-nin was so awful at invading the mainland. There was no practicing reliable tree running in a country like this. Not if you didn't want to break half your genins' necks. With the turnout rate of Kiri's academy already so low, he suspected they couldn't afford the risk. Still, he made the best of it. It was the first solo operation he had managed to wrangle out of the mission office and he intended to take advantage of it fully. He was lucky the mission parameters were vague. Scout out some of the larger towns and look for rebel activity. It had been high priority for Konoha to make contact with the rebellion, as they represented their best option for an alliance against the main invasion force. Failing that, it would at least confirm which faction it was attacking Konoha, and preferably establish a motive. Without knowing the goal for the war's extension, it was difficult to counter-plan against it. With Naruto's growing suspicions over who was really behind this conflict though, he thought the point might be moot. Still, the flexibility of his mission allowed him a lot of time to accomplish his own goals. Collecting indigenous fauna and flora for possible poisons was a part of it, but mostly Naruto was trying to get a general feel of the land. Most shinobi underestimated or outright ignored the civilian population of a nation as irrelevant. Food, clothing, manufacture. Ninja relied on the civilians for all of this, never really considering just where their fancy equipment or next meal came from. Naruto did not. Wave taught him just how a civilian population could be used if properly motivated. Just as shinobi tended to try and keep civilians out of their conflicts, that wall they built could be utilized both ways. It helped that civilians were much easier to manipulate. Money went a long way, and money used correctly even farther. It might be an oversimplification of the psychology, but helping somebody out tended to incline them better to you. For some reason, helping somebody with the implicit understanding that it was a quid pro quo relationship was even better. He supposed humans were naturally suspicious of apparent altruism, that probably spoke more of the world they lived in than of human nature. All Naruto knew was that it was useful. For instance, he might not have noticed his pursuer, if he hadn't offered to help in the kitchens of a struggling food stall he had stopped to eat in. The lovely waitress working there had been all too eager to tell him that she heard two people assumed to be shinobi had been asking questions about somebody matching his description. She had thought it fanciful gossip. After all, shinobi never came to a small village like theirs. They were good, he'd give them that. Only the fact that he didn't know who they represented stopped him from going into full counter-pursuit mode. Instead, he slipped on a branch again and stumbled somewhat awkwardly into a clearing, cursing under his breath in a convincing rendition of shinobi irritated by a foreign climate. It wasn't hard, he just had to channel Kiba on every single mission they had been on outside of Fire Country. He felt the attack before he actually saw anything, a kind of battlefield intuition to slight changes in the environment. At the last moment though, his would-be ambusher paused, dropping into the clearing themselves. "When did you substitute with the puppet?" a familiar voice asked. Zabuza-sama swears it was back at the river, but I think it was earlier, possibly by the willow tree. Naruto couldn't help the grin that spread his whiskered cheeks as he slipped from his hiding place amongst a small rock formation. It was back at the village, as I was leaving the stall. The figure rolled their eyes as they removed their stylized mask. I should have guessed. It's good to see you, Naruto. Naruto walked forward, still not quite letting his guard down. You too, Haku, and while I enjoy seeing a familiar face in this grim wetscape as much as the next guy, can I ask why you've been following me? He glanced around. Speaking of which, where's Zabuza and the other two who were with you? He hadn't actually managed to spot or sense Zabuza. The silent killing master was too good for that. But where Haku was, he was sure his master wasn't too far behind. Sweeping the area with the rest of our team, the Mizukage's ears are not to be underestimated. Team. Somehow, he couldn't imagine the gruff swordsmen shacking up with any more kids than he strictly needed, and even Haku was probably the exception there. I'm not sure what's more surprising, that, or the fact that you guys are back in Mizu. The effeminate boy merely smiled. I can only say that we were approached by an offer Zabuza-sama would struggle to refuse. Ah. Naruto mused understandingly. He finally realized there were others out to gut the Mizukage too. After Wave, he had looked up exactly why Zabuza had become a missing nin. That he was now apparently with the rebels wasn't a stretch by any means. Something like that, Haku admitted. I think the more interesting question is what you're doing out here all on your own. Naruto's smile grew. Come now, Haku, we both know I'm never truly alone. A finger twitched subtly and the Naruto in the center of the clearing matched his grin. A poor choice of words, but my point stands. The real blonde shrugged. The standard. Surveillance, scouting, collecting foreign specimens for poison research. I have to ask, do you know how Kirinin managed to keep the Enkidu fish's enzyme from breaking down outside of the body? Poisons aren't quite my field of expertise, but I believe it's some kind of powder in the sheaths. Naruto's lips twisted thoughtfully, before filing that away for later. It had been bugging him ever since he discovered the toothy little fish. Okay, second question. How do you guys put up with this damn mist? You get used to it, a new voice growled from out of nowhere, far too close for Naruto's comfort. And come to appreciate how easy it makes sneaking up on mouthy little tree brats. It's good to see you too, Zabuza. Still playing with dolls then? Still overcompensating with that ridiculous slab of metal you call a sword? It's called Kubakiri Boucho. I can introduce you two more personally if you'd like. No thanks, I'd prefer not to get in between lovers. Nice flak jacket. Konoha giving 'em out as consolation prizes now. Only if the rebellion's doing the same with headbands. What excessive amount of people did you have to kill for that one? There was a long pause before Zabuza gave a sharp-toothed grin. It's good to see you, brat. Glad you didn't lose that edge. Yeah, well, plenty of things to sharpen myself on as of late. The muscled man's smile only grew. Great, isn't it? Behind him, the two teens that had emerged from the forest with him just looked on in shock at their sensei casually bantering with a Konoha shinobi. They weren't sure which was more shocking, the casual banter, or that it was with a Konoha ninja. So, Naruto continued, I don't know if we could move this conversation to somewhere more secure. As he spoke, he walked his dummy clone over to himself and sealed the puppet back up in its scroll. He felt fairly secure with Haku and Zabuza and didn't think it likely that they would betray him. Besides, Ramia was waiting in the ground beneath them, ready to spring into action with a twitch of his fingers. Good point. I'm pretty certain this place is safe, but that bastard Yagura seems to have eyes everywhere nowadays. It's almost unnatural. Okay, hold up, one of the teens cut in, a lanky, white-haired kid with what was clearly the legendary needle sword, Nuibari, at his hip. His teeth weren't filed down though, which made him only a swordsman in training. I don't really get all this buddy-buddy with a tree hugger, but don't you think inviting him back to our camp is a bit much? I have to agree, the other one said, his meek demeanor clashing wildly with the enormous wrapped bundle on his back that could only be Samehada or Hiramekare. Last Naruto checked, Hoshigaki Kisame wasn't dead, so he figured it was the latter. I know Terumi-sama would be very displeased by this. Naruto quirked an eyebrow. Now there was an interesting name. Terumi had been on the lips of many higher-ups in Konoha's brass, mostly just for wondering if the infamous Kunoichi was still alive. People assumed she had some involvement in the rebellion, but nobody could say how much. They way this kid, with his glasses and spiky blue hair, said it, with hints of reverence and fear, spoke of a leader. That information alone meant his mission was already a success. Yeah, well, May ain't here, so when you're under my command, you do as I say. Zabuza growled back. Got it. Teething problems with the new team? Naruto asked, with a smile. Keeping the irreverent atmosphere of the greeting alive made it more likely that they would let more useful information slip. Like you wouldn't believe, I miss Manjutsu and Kushimaru. He leveled a pointed look at the two swordsmen in training. They knew when to keep their mouths closed. He rolled his shoulders and glanced west. Come on, the longer we're standing around here, the more likely we are to run into a patrol. May might be annoyed that I stopped for a chat, but she'd be even angrier if I lost her latest toys. I'm not that bitch's toy, the white-haired teen muttered, earning an imploring look from his companion. I wish you wouldn't say things like that, he moaned quietly. She always seems to find out. You remember what happened last time? The brash one seemed ready to retort, only to think better of it, paling slightly. Thankfully, he held his silence as the group made their way back to their concealed camp. Naruto dropped back to run alongside Haku at the rear, which also allowed Ramia to keep pace as she swam through the ground beneath them. No sword for you then? He asked. Haku could have it sealed away, but from what he had seen, being one of the swordsmen of the mist was a badge of honor, and he would most likely wear it with pride. Not really my style. He smirked, rapidly flashing through one-handed seals. He had gotten much faster at it than the last time they had spoken. Whispering something under his breath, he curled his hand like he was holding a sword, and in the next moment, he was. A beautiful shining blade of ice grew from his palm, a razor-thin rapier that, with a look of brief concentration, morphed into a broad longsword. I much prefer the adaptability of my Kekkei Genkai. Stick with what you're good at. Can't exactly argue with that myself. He forced himself not to glance at his hands, still deftly guiding Ramia through the earth. So, how'd you two get roped in with the rebellion? Last I checked, you were about as distrustful of other Kirinin as anyone could be. A more genuine smile took hold in Haku. It seems somebody else thought the same thing. Terumi May herself came to recruit us. Well, he looked down sheepishly. Zabuza-sama anyway, I was more of a bonus. Turns out most people thought the Yuki clan was wiped out for good. His pale cheeks reddened slightly. Terumi-sama keeps dropping these not-so-subtle hints about all these eligible young kunoichi, and settling down after the civil war is over. You guys are that confident, huh? The ice user smiled wanly. You sort of have to be in our situation, but for us, it's genuine. Terumi-sama is an amazing leader, not to mention incredibly powerful. She will make a wonderful Mizukage when all of this is over. That's a lot of praise. And all of it deserved, Zabuza cut in, steel in his tone. It was the kind Naruto had heard in the die-hard support of the Sandaime back home. He almost wanted to meet her now, if she could inspire that kind of loyalty from the grizzled butcher. Haku's right. May's a beast on the battlefield, she's got more than enough to succeed where I failed and put that bastard Yagura down for good. Especially after this latest stunt of invading the mainland. What does the rebellion think about that? Naruto asked, unable to resist now that he was so close to understanding the apparent method behind the madness. Honestly, Zabuza said, we have no idea. We were pretty wary for a trap for the first few weeks. He grinned at the blonde. Probably why you lot found us so hard to track down. Yeah, we knew about your little contact missions, just weren't sure if we could trust you yet. He shrugged, turning forward again. But it seems like he's really committing to this. Targets we thought were previously unassailable have become easy pickings, and the rebellion is taking full advantage of it, making more gains in the past few weeks than they have in years. He sighed, waving his hand dismissively. Either the bastard's finally gone off the deep end, or well, no. What? Naruto asked, perhaps a little too quickly in his curiosity. You can't just leave me hanging like that. Kid, I'm not supposed to be telling you anything, I'm just hoping I get to see you and Haku fight again. From the front of the group, the white-haired teen, Sugetsu if he remembered the disgruntled introduction properly, snorted. Haku versus this ass clown. No contest. Naruto ignored him and gave Zabuza a practiced grin. I'll fight Haku if you keep going, I'll even sweep the floor with 4 eyes and Drippy over there if you want. Now that I'd like to see, Zabuza barked over Sugetsu's muttered curses. Alright then, you really want to know. His expression sobered instantaneously. Look kid, I knew Yagura, or I thought I did. He was always a pretty cold guy, but he always had the best interests of Kiri at heart. We thought we were finally dragging ourselves out of the mire of a reputation we had made for ourselves. Then, overnight, the guy apparently goes off the deep end and declares war on every bloodline user in the country. People don't just change like that. I don't know, it's like the guy was being controlled, like he was under some kind of genjutsu. Not Naruto's skill of choice, nor was he particularly good at it, but he knew enough that he wasn't completely vulnerable to it. But what Zabuza was describing, it would be like no genjutsu he had ever heard of. That kind of sudden personality change was one thing, but holding as long as it had. Even if the controller was always around Yagura, maintaining that control over a shinobi powerful enough to become Mizukage and, if the rumors were true, a Jinchuriki to boot, was near impossible. Unless, of course, you had something like the Sharingan. Itachi was a well-known master of the art, possibly the greatest user of genjutsu currently alive. But the timelines didn't match up, unless Itachi had been manipulating Yagura since he was a little kid. Still, have there been many sightings of the Akatsuki in Mizu lately? Red clouds on black cloaks. The entire group went silent as one, and that told Naruto everything he needed to know. Hanabi felt like a little kid again as she made the little wooden doll dance on the table in front of her. She had once been told that her mother loved shadow puppetry, so much so that she would drag her father all the way to the capital to see famous productions. In her youth, Hinata had tried to learn the art as a way of connecting with their lost mother, with limited success. Hanabi had been delighted by the little performances her sister put on all the same. They were clumsy and simple, but it had been one of the few things the ill-fated siblings could enjoy together. Hiyashi had put a stop to it not soon after, likely finding him a painful reminder rather than a melancholic connection to the past. Having the simple wooden puppet twirl and spin to her whims, not quite as fluid as a real dancer, but much better than the jerky movements she had been capable of a month ago, it brought her back to those simpler times. Even the training itself was nostalgic, bringing to mind the strict regimens she had been under in the Hyuga compound. Although, Naruto was far from a strict mentor. Exacting, yes, but not strict. He simply expected her to do the best she could, and that seemed to have its own kind of weight in terms of motivation. It was surprising that, with the time he was forced to spend out of the village, mostly in Mizu no Kuni these days, coordinating with the rebels, he had the time to see to her training. But he did. She could tell it was beginning to stretch him a bit thin. He used clones still, but only ever for tedious, laborious work like constructing spare puppets or the paperwork used to manage his ever-expanding network of spies. Testing poisons, working on new designs, and training her. Those, he saw to himself, and it was beginning to grow too difficult to manage alongside his aggressive stance on missions. She knew that, eventually, he would have to give something up. She finished up her training by having the marionette move slowly through a basic stance of the Juken before having it hop into her hand. Her strings were still visible, and the wasted chakra meant the exercises were quite tiring. She moved through the building, aiming for where she knew Naruto would be working. She was a deft hand at navigating the controlled chaos of the various workshops by now, barely even noticing all the blonde-haired clones scurrying about their work. She only ever noticed when Naruto was gone. The building became almost eerily quiet without the low din of construction. They would have been perfect opportunities to slack off from her training, but she always suspected he would just know somehow. She found him precisely where she thought he would be. He was at his desk, observing two little puppet birds as they hopped about, twitched spontaneously, and generally acted like real birds. It was only when one ruffled its thin wooden feathers as if to take off that the disparity became obvious. It flapped twice, just about lifting itself into the air, only to flail awkwardly and quickly lose altitude. The other one, a slightly lighter shade of ochre, attempted something similar. It managed to get into the air, but it couldn't really be called flight, so much as it was awkward hovering. Still refusing to just import and use sooner would. She asked suddenly, annoyed when he didn't so much as twitch. She had been working on her ability to move quietly too. Too brittle for what I have in mind. I think I'm getting closer with the composite though, it's just getting the right balance between density and durability. One of the wooden birds flapped again and Hanabi saw the faint glint of metal along the front of its wings. All around the workbench and across the walls she could see dozens of different, hand-drawn designs, all of them sketched out mechanisms for a new puppet. There was definitely a bird theme, but she couldn't make out the end result. Well, there wouldn't be an end result if he couldn't work out how to make his creations fly, but she knew he had the persistence to make it happen. You have that look again, Naruto said, smirking as they tossed one of the puppets across the room to a small pile of its discarded counterparts, all different shades. What look? She shot back, doing her best to set her features as neutrally as possible. I don't have looks. He only had to stare at her bemusedly for a few seconds to make her realize what she said, her cheeks coloring instantly. You have that look that says, why can't I make my own puppet yet? Well, why can't I? She demanded, forceful enough that she hoped they wouldn't linger on how easily he could read her. He seemed ready to retort, only to pause thoughtfully, glancing down at the little doll in her hand. Show me how far you've come with that. A spark of hope welled in her chest as she opened her hand, only having to concentrate a moment to make her chakra strings latch on. Instead of setting the doll down, she had it leap from her hand. This wasn't a review, it was a demonstration. The doll landed in a tight roll, coming up in a dead sprint that would have looked quite dramatic if it wasn't making adorable little clicking noises as it ran across the table. It was suddenly forced to dive to the side as a wicked beak slammed down where it had just been, carving a sliver out of the table. Hey, Hanabi complained. Naruto just raised an eyebrow, almost lazily controlling the bird with 2 fingers. I said show me how far you've come. His fingers twitched, but this was no demonstration. He wasn't going to any lengths to slowly show how each movement altered the seals controlling his puppets. His movements were incomprehensible blurs. Hanabi knew she couldn't rely on him to understand what the bird was about to do. The anatomy doll jumped back, avoiding a low sweep from the bird's wing. Capped in sharpened metal as they were, it would have shone clean through the little marionette. It grabbed a pen off the desk clumsily, twirling it like a staff and slamming it into the bird's head to divert its next blow. Naruto's puppet clearly wasn't designed for combat, it was just an experiment in flight, but that didn't make its beak any duller. It reared up, wings flapping hard enough that if Hanabi hadn't braced the doll, it would have been bowled over. When it next lunged forward, Hanabi had the doll plant the pen like a polearm, so the point was driven down the bird's throat. If it was flesh and blood, it might have been a killing move, but as a puppet, it was no softer on the inside and it merely stuck the thing in place for a moment. Hanabi used the reprieve and had her doll leap forward, clambering awkwardly up the side of the bird until it had its little wooden arms wrapped around the larger puppet's neck. It thrashed and rolled, but couldn't dislodge its unexpected passenger. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Alright, that's enough, Naruto said, letting his strings go slack and the bird go still. Hanabi sighed and relaxed her own hand. It had been hard thinking on the fly, and harder still on her hand, unused to twitching and moving so suddenly in the heat of the moment. The moment she did, Naruto reacted faster than she could see. The bird lurched, throwing her doll off, and in the same movement speared forward. Its beak closed around the marionette's neck and snapped shut, decapitating it in an efficient, brutal move. Hey, Hanabi whined, snatching the doll back and frowning at the 2 severed parts. Important lesson of the day, Naruto said, ignoring her glare. You never let your guard down until you're certain your opponent is out of commission, or failing that, unable to attack. He glanced at the way she was cradling the worn old doll. He could repair it easily, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. You'll be practicing with something bigger soon enough. Hanabi seemed to forget about the doll almost instantly, her eyes lighting up excitedly. You mean? He nodded. I'm going to be gone for a few days. We've been encouraged to aid the rebels on a few operations they've been planning, to secure their help in encircling Kiri. When I come back, I expect to find you with a puppet that you've made yourself. My clones won't help you, and if I find you've repurposed any of the parts in my workshop, I'll take great pleasure in destroying that puppet in front of you. This has to be your work, from scratch. The girl nodded eagerly and made to rush off, only to nearly trip as a chakra string attached to her foot, freezing it in place. Where are you going? We still have your taijutsu practice for the day. What do you care? You hate taijutsu, she muttered, frustrated at being held back from something she had been anticipating for so long. Yes, and it's abysmal for it, a weakness I did my best to overcome by doubling down on my puppetry. You have no such excuse. You have a perfectly viable form that you're good at, she flushed a little from the rare praise, and have extensive teaching in. So, if you could go back, you'd focus more on taijutsu. she asked skeptically. He shrugged. Probably not, but I didn't have the benefit of a teacher willing to correct those missteps. He flexed his fingers and one of the sturdier dummy models hopped off a nearby rack. By force, if necessary. Grumbling to herself and rolling her eyes, Hanabi nevertheless acquiesced and began walking to the training room. How did you get so good at imitating the Juken, anyway? Naruto stayed quiet, causing her to sigh. That probably meant it had something to do with Hinata. Whenever she brought her sister up recently, her unconventional teacher clammed up tighter than the Hokage's office. It had the additional effect of making him go even harder in their training, but that was okay. She suddenly had a bit of frustration to work out. The rebels seemed very fond of their subdued little celebrations. He supposed it was necessary when you were forced out of your home and into a long, suffering fight against people you once thought of as friends. He did, however, think that celebrating after every successful mission by drinking themselves into a stupor was asking to get somebody killed. They were admittedly tight about their security, and a few people were always kept aside for the nightly watch, but it still seemed excessive. He sat towards the edge of the camp. It was away from the campfire, irritating, in the cloying damp that suffused Mizu no Kuni, but also away from all the Kiri rebels trying to get him to drink. He had never really worked out the appeal of alcohol and the drop in coherence that came with it. Still, he wasn't going to begrudge them for it. Despite the Mizukage's diverted attention, the target they had hit was still a tough one. As a prison camp for bloodline users, it should have been. They not only had to worry about attacks from the outside, but from their own prisoners. The fact that Yagura appeared to be taking prisoners as leverage instead of butchering them on the spot seemed to be a good sign. It said he believed he needed the advantage. The successful raid only boosted morale and, in general, spirits were high. But, they were also flowing freely, thus Naruto's separation. You could loosen up a bit, Sasuke said as he wandered over, the slight color in his cheeks showing that he hadn't been as successful in rebuffing the rebels' hospitality. It can't be healthy being so uptight all the time. Naruto scoffed good-naturedly, you're lecturing me on being uptight. He rolled his shoulders, the cold was making him stiff. Besides, you know what else isn't healthy? Having your throat slit because you were too drunk to notice an ambush. Sasuke shrugged uncaringly. It amazed Naruto constantly how much he had mellowed since their genin days. More specifically, since Sakura's death. It might have surprised some, but the blonde secretly believed that, between him, Sasuke and Kakashi, Sakura's death had hit the Uchiha hardest. It seemed to have brought into sharp focus every rebuffed attempt at a connection between the two she had ever made. After a long period of surly introspection, Sasuke had begun to open up to people more readily, almost as a way of making up for that now impossible relationship. He had never loved Sakura, or anything mushy like that. It was just a regret that he was trying to make up for, in his own way. If Naruto's intuition was right, he would make Junin soon. His interpersonal skills were really the only thing holding him back on that front. With what basically amounted to an apprenticeship under Kakashi, the one that had made a name for himself in the Third War, not their lazy, impudent teacher, he had been shaped into a powerful shinobi. Even for a ninja, you're paranoid, you know that. The dark-haired teen muttered, taking a long sip from his cup. It was some fruity drink that was so mild you almost forgot it was alcoholic, until the hangover reminded you, painfully, or you tried to drink too much, in which case it had a hell of a kick. The rebels seemed very fond of it. Paranoid, and not dead, Naruto countered with a grin, clinking his own cup of tea against Sasuke's. Fair enough, although I wouldn't count on it staying that way if you leave that simmering for much longer, the Uchiha said, inclining his head towards their approaching third teammate. Now if you'll excuse me, a certain Kunoiki has been making eyes at me across the campfire for the last few minutes. As an Uchiha, I feel obligated to let her know all about these eyes. And with that he lifted off the log they had been using as a bench and sauntered off. No fraternizing with foreign ninja, Naruto called after him, torn between grinning and frowning. All it earned him was a rude gesture behind the Uchiha's back. What felt like a long time ago now, Sasuke had introduced himself with two goals, to kill his brother, and to re-establish the Uchiha clan. It seemed the second point on the teens list was less of an afterthought these days. Still, Sasuke knew better than to do anything stupid. The real reason for the frown sat down next to him a moment later, looking into her own drink indecisively. It's nice to see them able to be so happy, despite everything they've had to struggle against, isn't it? They know tomorrow could be their last day, why not live it up every night? He said, lapsing the two into a silence. He still hadn't worked out what to do about this situation. Hinata had been mostly ignoring him since that night, out of embarrassment or waiting for him to do something, he couldn't tell. It crept into his thoughts occasionally, like an unwanted intruder in his mind, and he still hadn't come to any kind of conclusion. She was attractive. He could see that objectively. She was clearly enamored with him. He could also see that she was submissive, and didn't ask a lot of probing questions of him, which should have been a plus. At the same time, he just hadn't considered a relationship like that, at all. What was the point? If he was going to live to an age where that kind of thing mattered, then he could deal with it later. If he didn't, he would be dead. Hinata had forced his hand a little. Did he like her? She was nice to be around, he supposed. He certainly got along with her better than most. Although, that might have been habituation more than anything, with how often he'd had to coordinate with her when his spy network was still a budding, unstable thing. The last person he had genuinely had a crush on was Sakura, and look how that turned out. But in all seriousness, working with his puppets, especially in understanding the underlying anatomy, had almost completely desensitized him to the female form. Or maybe it was getting wrist deep in Kin's chest cavity when he was 13 years old. He could look at it from an aesthetic viewpoint, admire it even, but it didn't particularly stir anything in him like he supposed it should. Again, it was something he hadn't put a lot of thought into. What he did know, was that this awkward silence was extending well past his tolerance. Just as he was about to turn and say something, Hinata beat him to it. I wanted to apologize, she murmured, unable to pull her gaze out of her drink. It was the same thing the rebels were drinking. She apparently needed some liquid courage to even broach this. It was inappropriate of me to put that kind of pressure on you. We're at war, and there are so many things going on. I was drinking and, I don't know, Ino must have put something strange in my head that night. Normally I would never have been so bold. It's all right, he managed, somewhat lamely. No, she continued, her shoulders slumping progressively as she spoke. I was foolish to even think you would look that way at someone like me. I'm not strong, like you. I don't have your dedication, or drive. When people hated you for being a Jinchuriki, it only made you fight harder. I can't even protect my own sister. Naruto's eyes widened. He hadn't thought anybody from his generation had worked that out, except maybe Shikamaru. I should go. She made to stand, only to gasp as she felt a warm hand close around hers, pulling her back down. His other hand found her chin, turning her until they were facing. His eyes searched her face for a moment, picking every detail apart. She felt like a puppet in that moment, under his scrutinizing gaze. It was like she couldn't move. Not until he commanded it. His eyes were distant, calculating, as if 1,000 unseen gears were churning away behind those blue orbs. All the same, she felt warm. His were eyes that saw potential in lifeless wood, and a small, longing part of her had always hoped that he would see something in her, that she couldn't see herself. When he leaned forward, it was hesitant, testing. She couldn't even bring herself to reciprocate, too frozen by that roiling cloud of doubt swirling in her chest. It tightened like a clamp with every inch he crossed. This wasn't real. This was some terrible illusion that would shatter in a few moments. She would wake up and this would all be a bittersweet. His lips were cold from the chilly night, their touch sending a spark of electricity down her spine, jolting her into the moment. She closed her eyes and sank into it, tentatively shuffling forward when a firm, calloused hand found her shoulder. They broke for a breath, and Naruto seemed ready to pull back. She didn't let him. Feeling a burst of courage burst from the bubbling happiness exploding in her chest, she brought a hand up behind his head, enjoying the feel of his spiky locks being drawn between her fingers. When they did finally part, her cheeks were flushed, and her breaths came in short, quivering bursts. A wavering smile dancing across her lips. She looked up, and her heart broke. Naruto's expression had barely changed. He was looking at her like a particularly unsatisfying experiment. And she knew, for her sake, he had at least tried, but he had felt nothing. He could feel nothing, not for somebody like her. Thank you, she managed, lip trembling as she stood to go. It was all she could do to salvage her shattered self-esteem. You're not worthless, he spoke up when she had taken a few steps, freezing her in place as surely as if she were bound in strings. You're not the weak, spineless girl you've been brought up to see yourself as. I've seen strength in you, a dedication to succeed, to grow past the image your family has mired you in. I know you look to me and see strength, and I'm not entirely sure why. She almost whimpered. How could he not see? But she said nothing, could say nothing as he spoke. But if you look hard enough, you'll see that same determination in yourself, if you look past what other people say you are. He let out a long breath, and Hinata was freed, but before she could walk away, he sighed. I am sorry. I want you to know that. That was too much for her, and she walked away as quickly as she could. He sat there, silently, staring at his own hands clasped together. Without even looking, he grabbed the drink Hinata had abandoned and downed it in one. It burned going down his throat, and Naruto began to understand why the Kiri rebels were so fixated on celebrating the small victories. The failures always felt so much worse. Hanabi hovered uncertainly at the edge of Naruto's periphery, never quite working up the courage to say something. He had come home in a strange mood, breezing right by her and falling into his work with a vengeance that spoke of the need to exhaust everything else from his mind. Normally, when he was in these kinds of moods, she would do her best to avoid him until he defrosted. Right now though, she was torn between her own nervousness and excitement. She shuffled a little closer and cleared her throat quietly for the third time, hoping this would be the one he noticed. When he turned sharply, swiveling on his chair with a cold look, she wished he hadn't. What? He hissed. Can't you see I'm doing something important? Hanabi shrank back under that gaze. She couldn't remember a time he had ever spoken to her like that before. You said? Sorry, it's just, she backpedaled, looking down abashedly. It was like she was a little girl, being chewed out by one of the elders again. It all rushed back so clearly. Look down. Don't meet their eye. Whatever you do, don't cry. My puppet. She heard him sigh, and tentatively looked up. He was rubbing his temple, and in that moment just looked tired more than anything else. Sorry, I didn't mean to be so short. He chuckled humorlessly. Guess today is the day where I can't help but disappoint Hyugas. He cracked his neck and put on a grin, although it was strained. Come on, let's go take a look. She was a little put out by his casual tone, as if her first effort at a puppet was just some passing attraction to glance at and move on. But, she could see even this much congeniality was effort for him today, so she wisely said nothing, instead leading him to the training room she had commandeered. He walked over to her creation and began to examine it thoroughly. She'd had so many childish ideas about what she could make for her first puppet, many of which proved completely infeasible due to the time frame, and her inexperience. She had read all of the books Naruto had collected over the years on woodcrafting and engineering, but putting it into practice was a different thing entirely. It wouldn't win any prizes for beauty, but Hanabi had done her best, and it worked. In the end, it ended up a lot like a rougher version of Dami, the refined ones that he used these days, at least. The wood had a rough-hewn look, the marks of the plane clearly visible, but it was definitely humanoid. It was also a great deal more feminine than the purposefully androgynous Dami, a few inches taller than Hanabi herself. It was fully articulated, and had a few hidden compartments with rudimentary Senbon launchers she had reverse-engineered from Naruto's. He hadn't said she couldn't do that after all. Naruto walked around it in a circle, testing each joint individually before latching his strings on. Hanabi's lips curled when she saw how fluidly her own creation moved under his gentle ministrations. She couldn't get it to move like that, and it was extremely tiring just to run it through a single kata of the Juken. She hovered to the side, stomach churning anxiously, but so far, the blonde hadn't looked displeased. Eventually, after he had run Mari, what she had named the puppet, through some sort of internal checklist, his features softened. I'm a little jealous, he murmured. It was possibly the first time she could have ever called one of his smiles wistful. The soft remark caught her off guard. While satisfied with her creation, she knew it wasn't anywhere close to the intricacy or elegance of Naruto's constructs. In Naruto's eyes, it was very different. Despite building Mari from scratch, Hanabi had all sorts of advantages Naruto couldn't have dreamed of when beginning his long journey. She had his materials. The first incarnation of Dami had been roughly put together from whole pieces of timber. Naruto had been forced to cut down a tree from the training grounds himself. It had taken nearly 2 days, and the end result had been animated more through raw power than any kind of finesse. His knowledge of the various control seals was shaky at best back then, so he had brute forced it. She also had access to the knowledge he had spent years collecting and integrating into his style. His bookshelf had once encompassed his windowsill and his bedside table. Now, using his clones to steal or copy any interesting bit of literature on a whole range of subjects, he had an entire, dedicated room set aside as a library. Most importantly, Hanabi had an example. She had dedicated teaching. She had somebody to make the mistakes for her, so she would never have to. It was something a younger Naruto had dreamed about having growing up, his mental image of Sasori only going part of the way in that regard. Now that he was that person, it brought up strange feelings in his chest. Mari was no beauty, true. But she was better than anything Naruto could have made in her place. Come on, he muttered, shelving his turbulent feelings behind a smile. Let's put her through her paces, shall we? That one, small confirmation was all Hanabi needed to banish her lingering anxiety, latching her strings to Mari as Naruto walked a copy of Dami into the room. Naruto had to give Mizu no Kuni one thing: the nights were beautiful. Lying there, staring up at the shimmer of the swirling mists, he could understand why a people could grow proud of this country. Nights in Konoha were usually either mired behind the haze of the village's lights, or obscured by the broad canopy of their forest trees. Nothing could beat a fire country sunset, but the still serenity of the stars here came close. Of course, the only reason he knew this was because he couldn't use a tent when sleeping. The shine of condensation on the fabric would have been a dead giveaway to any passing patrols. So, they had to use specially constructed, camouflaged sleeping rolls. In Konoha, sleeping outside was tolerable thanks to the muggy warmth that lingered through the night. Mizu's nights were less hospitable, and a chill wrapped itself around his bones the moment he tried to close his eyes. With a sigh that condensed into a pearly mist in front of him, he silently rolled out of his sleeping mat, still fully clothed. He couldn't even use a jutsu to warm himself, he might alert a nearby sensor. He began running through some dexterity exercises that had practically become muscle memory at this point. It warmed his fingers at least. The rest he did by cycling his chakra like he was trying to break a genjutsu. It didn't actually do anything, but it felt good to keep busy. The faint hiss was low enough that, had he still been trying to doze off in his bedroll, he might not have heard it. It was his only warning before the ceiling tags planted around the small camp released the deadly payload. In less than a second, the entire camp was smothered in a thick, noxious blanket of purple smoke. In the same amount of time, Naruto had dived forward, already pulling a small, portable rebreather out of a pocket and jamming it over his mouth. When he looked back, the entire camp had vanished behind a deadly smokescreen, save for a single figure moving forward. Their features were obscured by the poison swirling around their body, but their voice was all too recognizable. I underestimated your will to live. I would very much like to know how you managed to counteract my poison. Sasori didn't quite fully emerge from the smokescreen, looking even more intimidating with his body partially obscured. Surprised to see me. You could say that, Naruto said slowly, eyes scanning the tree line behind the other puppeteer. Then you disappoint me again. To think that you would have such trust in a weak, fledgling network of informants. No contingencies. No assurances. It was almost insultingly easy to slip my own agents in place. True agents, loyal only to me. He scowled, taking a step forward. I don't know why I ever thought you might be interesting, you're just a... I said, Naruto interrupted with a smirk. You could say that. His finger twitched ever so slightly and the various explosive traps he had hidden around the fake campsite ignited. The explosions themselves were spectacular, brilliant, if quiet, thanks to the silencing barrier inscribed 20 feet out from the decoy camp in every direction. When the poison shroud Sasori had released caught though, it turned into a true conflagration, forcing Naruto to shield his eyes even with his goggles. Or, he muttered to himself, you could say that I've been slowly feeding misinformation to my own network for the better part of a month, in the hopes that somebody would eventually slip you something. He removed the gas mask and smiled grimly. Thanks for proving me right. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.